We're back with part 2 of our Passover lesson. Part 1, we learned about how Jesus met with his disciples in the upper room in the house in Jerusalem for the Passover meal. So how do Jewish people celebrate Passover today? Well, they have something called the Talking Feast, also known as a Seder. Seder means order. Here is the very first Seder plate that I ever bought. It's a child's plate, and you can see these kind of like little cups, and they have pictures of food items on there, and that tells you what food to put in the little cups. Now we have a larger Seder plate here that we have ready with all the food in it, and that's what we're going to use tonight. So before the Seder begins, the leader of the Seder always washes their hands, and we know how important that is to do now, right? But that's actually part of the Seder. And then the youngest child begins by asking 4 questions. They say, why do we eat matzah bread tonight? And why do we eat bitter herbs? And why do we dip our vegetables twice? And why do we eat reclining? Why is this night so different from all other nights? So let's answer some of those questions. Well, you know they eat matzah bread, right? Because they had to have unleavened bread that didn't have yeast in it because they didn't have time for the yeast to cause the bread to rise. And then they ate that night the Passover meal standing up. God said, eat with your sandals on, your coat tucked in, and be ready to go when you eat the bitter herbs and the Passover lamb and the unleavened bread. So that was the only night that they ate the Passover meal standing up, because they were still slaves and they had to be ready to go. After that, they ate all the Passover meals as free people, and they took it a step further and they say, we're going to eat this as kings and queens would eat it, reclining. And so today at a Seder table, they usually put a pillow behind them and they recline back into the pillow and they eat as kings and queens as they tell the story of the first Passover and the Exodus from Egypt. So that answers a couple of the questions. Now, to our plate. Well, you've got bitter herbs. So you take some of your matzah bread and you dip it in your bitter herbs, and the bitter taste in your mouth brings tears to your eyes, and you recall the bitterness of the slavery. And then you take your green vegetable, which represents new life, and you dip it in salty water, and the drops of water that come off remind you of the tears that were shed as slaves in Egypt, and the taste as well. And then my favorite food item on the plate is the charaset. You can see that. It looks a little bit like mud. There we go. And remember the Hebrews made bricks out of mud and straw. This is real mud and straw for Pharaoh. And so that's what this food item looks like, but it tastes sweet. It's delicious. And you make it with applesauce and cinnamon and dates, but every Jewish family has a different recipe. And it's nice to have something sweet to follow the bitterness and the saltiness. So also, the leader will take some of the unleavened bread, break it in half, and put a piece in a little bag called the afikomen bag. Afikomen is a Greek word that means to save for later. And then they hide this bag, and the children look for the bag later. But before they do that, they have a sip of the cup, and the second time they do that, they dip their finger in it and they drop some juice on their plate 10 different times, and each time they say one of the plagues that struck Egypt. Can you remember all the plagues? It was the blood, and then the frogs, the gnats or the lice came in, and then the flies swarmed in, the livestock that were in the fields died, the boils or the sores came up on all of the people, and then they had a hailstorm that destroyed most of the crops. Then A swarm of locusts came in and devoured what was left. Then they had the plague of darkness that covered Egypt. And then the very last plague, the 10th plague, was where the firstborn of all the Egyptians died that night. And that was the night of the first Passover, because the Hebrew slaves took the blood of the lamb that they had sacrificed and roasted, and they painted it on their doorpost with a bunch of hyssop that was used like a paintbrush. And that blood of the lamb protected them that night as the death angel passed over their homes, and they were saved. Pharaoh finally changed his mind because he lost his firstborn son, and he told Moses, let the people go. So they were ready, and they left Egypt and became a free people. And that's what we celebrate each year at Passover. As Christians, we can take something from this, and we realize that Jesus, like the leader of the Seder, who takes the unleavened bread and breaks it at the end and gives a little piece to each person at the table, Jesus did the same thing, and he said, but I'm giving you a new commandment. Now today is Maundy, Thursday on our calendar, on the Christian calendar, and we normally meet at church and we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Well, the Lord's Supper, when he celebrated it, it was a Passover meal, and he broke the bread and he said, I'm giving you a new commandment, a new covenant I'm making with you now. And you see, Maundy, Thursday is a Latin phrase, that it's a fancy phrase, a way of saying a new commandment I give to you. So you break the bread and you think of me and my broken body hanging on the cross for you. And so that's the new promise, that because Jesus became the sacrifice, he became the Passover lamb, and his body was broken, and it hung on the cross, and then he died to save us all from our sins. And that's what Easter is really all about. He gave us hope.